Welcome to episode number 24 of the Detour 365 podcast. This is your host, William, and I will be with Bill and Nathaniel this evening. We will be looking at Genesis 5, 21 through 24, as well as Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and also the book of Enoch. This evening we will be looking at the story of Enoch and his relationship with God, and of course, since we are in the series Humanity of God, we will be looking at that aspect in the story, how God relates with Enoch, and also mentioning a few things about the book of Enoch since it is relevant to this discussion. Now, this is just part one. We will be continuing with part two next week, and also discussing Noah in that episode. So we hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening. And here is episode number 24. We are talking about Enoch, but we're not talking about Enoch because this is the Humanity of God series. So we're looking at how God is relating to Enoch, which also has a lot to do with Enoch, and we will be mentioning the accounts of Enoch, or what we know of Enoch from the Bible, or the main canon of Scripture, and then we will also mention the book of Enoch later on, which there is I believe it's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that has the book of Enoch in their canon of Scripture, so it won't be in most Bibles you'll find, like it won't be in an ESV Bible or an NIV or something like that, but it is referenced in the book of Jude and yes, the book of Jude. And Enoch was a real guy, and we'll go into that later on, but there is some explanation as to why we are looking at it, but also it's kind of appropriate since we're discussing Enoch to not mention that the book of Enoch would probably be overlooking something that is potentially very significant to what we are discussing. So our first passage is, of course, from Genesis chapter 5, where we are introduced to Enoch and what happened with him. So it's Enoch 5, 21 through 24, and Nathaniel's reading that, I believe.
Yes, let me find the tab again here. All right. So this chapter is titled "From Adam to Noah," right?
Oh no, just 21 through verse 21 through 24.
I'm just verifying I'm on the right chapter, though.
Yeah, it's a genealogy, and okay. Enoch is mentioned in there. So
verse 21.
Yes.
When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away.
Very good. So
that was from the NIV, so maybe it was a bit less flowery.
Well, I have a few different translations that might. So the Amplified version says, and this is just that last verse, and in reverent fear, in parentheses, in reverent fear and obedience, parentheses, Enoch walked with God, and he was not. Parentheses again, found among men. So he was not found among men, comma, because God took him, and then another parentheses, away to be home with him. And then we have the literal standard version, which says, Enoch habitually walks with God, and he is not, for God has taken him. Then I figured I'd bring one from the Tyndale Bible from the 1500s. 1526 translation. So this is like older English, but I found it kind of interesting the way they worded things. And Enoch lived a godly life and was no more seen, for God took him away. New Living Translation says, walking in close fellowship with God, then one day he disappeared, because God took him. So that's a more like modern version of it. So, let's see. Yeah, so, the Brenton Septuagint translation, and I'd never heard of this translation before, but it was one of the translations that was on there, on Bible Hub, but said, and Enoch was well-pleasing to God, and was not found, because God translated him. So, there you go. Translated him. Anyway.
It's an interesting choice of words, because to translate an object means to move it without changing it, right? In, like, physics.
Yeah.
I think something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was abducted by aliens.
Well, that is something that, well, it's funny that you mention that, because a lot of people are fascinated with the Book of Enoch. Not necessarily just Christians, but there are people that read the Book of Enoch because it has some passages in it that are very, it does kind of seem like it does kind of seem like he was abducted or something. The way that it describes some of the things that he experienced, well, without going off into that tangent there, but it's very much like he kind of was taken off the face of the earth, and he was taken up and given I'll hold back on that until we talk about the Book of Enoch, but Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and the reason we're reading this is because this gives us the context of what was happening during the time of Enoch. And it shows us how he stood out as someone who walked with God, and also Enoch is right before Noah. Noah is when the flood happened, and we're told that things were, well, this Genesis 6 gives you an explanation as to what was happening during the time of Enoch, which also gives us the reason for the flood, which we'll talk about next week, but it's important because this was kind of the status of things at the time of Enoch. So Genesis 6, 1 through 4.
In time, when men began to multiply on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Adonai said, my spirit will not live in human beings forever, for they too are flesh. Therefore, their lifespan is to be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the ancient heroes, men of renown.
Very good. And what's really intriguing about that passage as well is that it corroborates well, it agrees with a lot of the content of the Book of Enoch, because the Book of Enoch really goes into detail. And again, this is not necessarily saying that we should buy everything that's in there, word for word in the Book of Enoch, but it does give kind of a detailed explanation as to how this happened. So the sons of God, which I believe it's understood to be angels. So angels have free will. These divine beings, like humans, have a form of, they're able to obey God or not. And these individuals decided to descend on the earth and impregnate some women. And the women gave birth to these Nephilim, which were kind of like these hybrid beings that were kind of like monsters. I'm really paraphrasing here, but and also these sons of God, or these angelic beings that were not good. They were going against what God wanted. They were kind of anyway. They taught men a lot of things that eventually led to, well, for example, how to how to mine metals and make metal weapons and kill each other with metal weapons. One of them taught men how to do that, and another one taught women how to apply makeup to make themselves look better and more attractive. And so there were a lot of things they taught people, along with also interbreeding with them. And then, but all this stuff kind of backfires because the these monsters, or these kind of terrifying things, are created that start to kind of devour the earth. And also people are even more corrupt, humans are even more corrupted by all of these new inventions and technologies that they have, and they have more ways to kill each other and to do harm. So that initially there's kind of some benefit, they see kind of some benefit to some of these things, but they end up being corrupted by them.
Even back when, at the advent of what we might sort of start to call like technology, the technological era, they already had recognized the danger inherent in technological advancing, and kind of the distance between how humans are designed to function and how technology allows us to kind of function differently.
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah, the Book of Enoch definitely goes into detail about that, and
it's a temptation to us that we're not inherently designed for. Really, technology does in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it paints the picture that, not necessarily that we're the victims, but the Book of Enoch does kind of explain how things got to where they were at the time of Noah, and why things were also kind of pretty bad at the time of, starting to get pretty bad at the time of Enoch.
Well, that sounds like, if that's the basis for that argument you're talking about there, then it sounds like it is laying it at the feet of technology, which...
Well, they were given all this knowledge and technology, but they weren't given the wisdom to go along with it. And some of the technology was like the angel, the one that taught them how to make weapons and stuff, that was not a good thing in the well, I guess they could use it for hunting and that kind of thing, but they used the weapons to, they quickly started using the weapons to kill each other, and, it kind of got out of hand. And anyway, so Jude is a book in the New Testament. It's a very short book. It's a letter, epistle, right? Epistle of Jude. It's very short. It's right at the end of the Bible. I'm just going to read 2 verses from it, and the reason why I'm reading it is because the book of Enoch is referenced and kind of quoted here. Enoch, so this is Jude 1, 14 through 15. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them, saying, "See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones, to judge everyone and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and all the defiant works ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So this is important in our context here because it does kind of give some legitimacy to the book of Enoch. Aside from the fact that there are Christians who recognize, not a majority by any means, but that do recognize the book of Enoch as something that we should definitely read. There's some that say don't read it, but this at least quotes it, references it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that, I agree. It does seem to introduce some sort of, inherent discussion on, okay, well, are we picking and choosing what we believe out of Enoch? Because we're admitting that part of it's canonical or whatnot.
Yeah.
How are we picking and choosing?
Well,
that is non-canonical text.
What I see, and this kind of gets into, well, I can kind of skip ahead to this for a second. I made a little video midweek over that topic of, should we read the book of Enoch? How should we read it? Just kind of my beliefs about it. But, if you're reading, I guess there are a few questions to ask. Are you reading the Bible, Genesis and those books first? Are you reading the book of Enoch more than anything else? I don't think that's necessarily what, I kind of see it as a resource that can add to, because it does contain a lot of information, and if you're curious and find it interesting, and especially if we're talking about Enoch, it's definitely appropriate to look at it. My own personal beliefs about why it might not be in the Bible is because, the Bible's written for a very specific purpose. There's a lot even in Genesis that we're not given just because it's a book about how to have a relationship with God, and Genesis 2 also kind of gives us very broad strokes with a lot of things. Just like they talk about the Nephilim and what happened there, just 2 sentences. We're not really given a big explanation. We're just kind of okay, that happened. But, so I kind of see the book of Enoch as a complementary thing. Complementary thing to read. But also,
part of me, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, I mean, knowing the main parts of the Bible first really well, then from there looking at the book of Enoch, if you're led to do so, I could see as being kind of a good way to look at it. There's a lot in Enoch that does agree with what we see in Genesis, or at least it gives a little more in-depth explanation. The only things that are kind of against, that are kind of go against, or why people would say you shouldn't look at it, have to do with that it's an unknown author is one, and it wasn't, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is very old, and it's one of the Oriental, as they say, churches, so it has a little bit different canon of Scripture. So without going into history as to how that happened, also, it could be, and I don't think this is true for us, because I think we can, I'm not saying like we're better than anybody or anything like that, but I think some people who read the book of Enoch might be a little bit confused by it, or especially if you're somebody who's new and you haven't read the Bible that much to begin with. Like if you're a new Christian, or you're just kind of getting into like understanding what the Bible's the basic story, and you read the book of Enoch, it could really, it's like beginning with reading Revelation, or, it's like there's a lot in there. There's a lot of...
Well, part of me does resent, well, you said the Bible was written for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
Inferring that information was picked and chosen to be included with that purpose in mind.
It was.
Right. And,
well,
part of me does resent being treated like a child in that way, because just give me all the information.
Well,
don't manipulate me, please.
You got to keep in mind too that the Bible's already a pretty big collection of, it's a lot of work. I mean, if you look at the ancient world, like
using a different argument. If your argument is now that it's that way to be shorter.
Well, no, I mean, it says it in the book of John. It says it in John. At the end of the book of John, there's a little thing where he says, and this kind of gives a good explanation, because the book of John is about the life of Jesus. He says at the very end of the book of John, now there were many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So he does say there, I mean, pretty much up front, like, we put the most important stuff in here. There was a lot of other things that we could have put in here, but, so, I mean, and it is true, too. I mean, if we look at Genesis, there's obviously a lot of stuff that's left out of Genesis, because it goes pretty quickly from the creation to
but none
other
of our
events.
Previous discussion as to why Enoch was not included centered around an argument saying that it was not included because it would make the Bible longer. It was because it would either confuse people, or it was just the information within was of dubious value.
I think it's, I mean, it is in some Bibles. It is in, if you're in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's in there. So it is kind of a controversial topic because of that. Because some people say, like, well, don't bother with it, it's just an extra thing. And then other people are like, well, no, it's referenced, and it does have a lot of good information in there. And it is interesting, I gotta say that, because if you're interested in... There's a lot in there that... I mean, there's just a lot in there that kind of explains things, definitely. Just to reference a few things here. The book of Enoch... let's see, explains kind of what happened with these watchers or these angels, what it goes into detail about the Nephilim, what they were doing, how humanity became corrupted by the presence of these beings, but also the technology, and why the flood happened, because we're just told in Genesis that that humanity was corrupted and the world was in such a state that the flood happened, And also there's some future predictions in Enoch that talk about the Messiah, that talk about the new heavens and new earth that God's going to establish. And
I read the very beginning of it, and it talked about the judgment. Same sounded like it was talking about the time of judgment when
Yeah.
God will return.
And also judgment of... Well, another thing about Enoch is that it goes into... What's that?
I did notice that it only said on the Earth. So this better happen within the next 100 years, because we're definitely going to be living on the moon and Mars within 100 years. So there's a timer going on.
Well...
Just saying.
Yeah. Well, the book of Enoch also talks about the judgment that the angel, the angelic beings or the sons of God that rebelled, and what their fate is going to be, and how God's going to deal with them. So there is a lot of information there that doesn't necessarily apply to us, but it does give us some information about what happened.
And so I could understand why. So earlier I said that I resented being treated like a child with restricted information.
Yeah.
But I do believe that's necessary throughout various points in your life. Like, you do have to treat people like children for something, especially like in the beginning of processes and
right.
whatever.
It's good to get the basics down first, for sure.
Yeah, so I could understand like introduction to, like, we'll just say Christianity would be best done in a certain order, possibly. But having information restricted at the highest level, essentially, like just saying, oh, this information is pretty much off the table, like, forever.
That's no
counter. Well, it's not restricted, but it's disowned, essentially.
The book of Enoch is not really disowned because it is still considered sacred text.
It's not considered canonical.
It is considered canonical in one of the Christian churches, and
exactly.
it is still widely available.
Well, that is true. That is true.
Well, it's only widely available because it was rediscovered in like 1700 or something.
But
in Ethiopia.
But it is still widely available. But
it is now, but it wasn't for 1700 years. I don't know how long, but
and the major point is the Bible as we know it has been presented to us so people can come.
Well, it looks like there was a technical issue there, so we will be right back in a few seconds. We are back in our discussion of God and Enoch and this Humanity of God series, but this topic of Enoch is kind of, even though we're just given a little bit of information about him in Genesis, it is kind of a bigger topic because we have this book of Enoch and we have a lot going on at the time of Enoch, and also this will relate to our discussion of Noah later on because they're kind of tied. The story of Enoch and the story of Noah are kind of tied together. And was there something you were saying, Bill, right before we got the untimely technological thing?
I think one thing that we have to remember about the Bible is what we have in the canon of the Bible as we are presented with it today is its primary goal is to provide us with what we need to establish a good relationship with Jesus Christ. That is its main goal. And yes, there is significant extra biblical stuff that is of interest. But what is important to our relationship with Jesus is contained in what we have presented in the current canon in the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the purpose of the Bible as we have it today, and the one that you normally pick up. Now, that does not mean that these other things have no value.
One important, I guess, thing to consider too, and this gets to the question of how does God interact with Enoch, and then we'll get to the question of why does he interact with Enoch in this way. So what we're given in Genesis is that Enoch walks with God, then God takes him, and then that alone opens up some questions. And then in the book of Enoch, we're given some insight that God gives him some assignments, a purpose, and visions and prophecies, but also he's given work to do as far as what's going on with, the fallen angels and the, all that. So he's kind of given a mission, you could say. But I did want to ask this question, and this question gets to kind of also our broader topic of the series. Enoch, as well as Noah, as well as a lot of people in the Old Testament that God interacts with, they were not... They were not perfect. They were still humans, so they still... Even though Enoch walked with God and he tried to live a righteous life, we're given that picture of him. He wasn't. We know that he wasn't perfect, and it just kind of makes me wonder. God had this unique relationship with Enoch, just like God had the unique relationship with Moses, with Abraham, with a lot of these individuals. And this was before the time of the Messiah, before the time of Jesus coming and giving us a way to have a close relationship with God. So I by our sins being forgiven, and God, so I'm wondering if God gives some sort of grace to these individuals so that. And it could be explained that, God is above time, so perhaps God applied the, grace to these individuals. I just often wonder in the Old Testament where you have people, like even the people that go into God's presence, like the prophets, and that... Moses, especially Moses, we're told that Moses talked to God face to face. We're told here that Enoch was walking with God, and this was before Enoch was before Abraham, certainly, and it's evident that God noticed this man, Enoch, that he was different, that it could be his faith, that he had a desire to commune with God, and that God honored that, even though Enoch was technically a sinner, because he wasn't, it's because that's often an argument used, if you sin once, you need to be forgiven. God has to forgive you in order to...
Well, I don't know how much it has to do with it, but one thing it notes here in verse 21 and 22 of chapter 5 is Enoch lived 65 years and fathered Methuselah. And after Methuselah was born, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. There was a fundamental change in Enoch after Methuselah was born. And I know that there was a fundamental change in me after my son was born. I had no real concept of the depth and breadth of love until my son was born.
I mean,
that opened up a whole a whole different part of life and living and understanding that I had never had before in my life.
I mean, I agree with you, but you know, this is a genealogy, and it has a lot of other people that had kids that didn't respond the way Enoch did, or what, you know, if this happened, you know, after the birth of Methuselah. But also, I just wonder how God overlooked. Yeah, well, yeah, I just am wondering how God not overlooked, but how God dealt with these individuals in the Old Testament because they're not, you know, they didn't, well, I mean, Enoch foretold you know, some of them foretold the Messiah and believed that the Messiah was going to come, and so I guess you could say they had some faith there, but, you know, it's different. I guess it is different for us because we're given that option, you know. We're given that way. But I just wonder how God dealt with these people, these individuals in the Old Testament who were chosen, and, you know, because they weren't without sin. You know, Moses made mistakes. David made mistakes. You know,
I think it depends upon their hearts.
Yeah.
You know, you look at people in the Old Testament, and you know, one of the primary examples in the Old Testament is David.
Yeah.
You know, look how sinful David was.
What question are we trying to answer right now?
But David was a man after God's own heart. We're talking about the differences in people, and you know,
I mean, like,
why some people were chosen and some weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of gets to this, like, you know, why did God have anything to do with this Enoch guy? Because, you know, we're told on the one hand that, and this gets to kind of the human aspect of God, you know, we're told on the one hand that God's perfect and can't tolerate any kind of, sin or imperfection in the presence, you know, but God deals with these people in the Old Testament kind of in a more, it seems like kind of in a more human way, in that God kind of takes into account their heart and their circumstances and has some measure of forgiveness and grace towards these individuals and allows them to interacts with them in a very intimate way,
Yeah, it sounds like, the only thing that the excerpt that we read says is that Enoch had a close relationship with God. He walked with God.
Yeah.
And therefore was picked off or taken with.
Well, and also
that other people did not have as close a relationship.
Yeah. But it does seem like in the examples we've looked at so far and the examples we will look at, in order to relate with God, God has to kind of agree to be relatable with us. If that, I guess Jesus is the perfect example because, God coming as fully human, fully God, and that's like a way to perfectly relate to us. But, Moses was able to relate to God and have a conversation with God. But, when Moses asked to see God's, fullness and glory, God said, well, you can't see all of it because if you saw all of it, you'd die. It'd just be too much. So
I think I have like a two-part thought here if I can hang on to it.
Okay.
Imagine how you'd feel about a God that was just completely implacable.
Right.
Logic would say that if God knows everything, then why would he have any emotion ever? Because he already knows exactly what's going to happen. Makes zero sense to have any sort of emotional involvement with events that you're just completely sure of what's going to happen. Right? It's like watching a movie that you've watched 1 billion times for the billionth and first time. Like, that sounds like kind of like hell, actually. But, so anyway, that's one question. But, also I think it's true that you can't love something that's perfect. You can take cars, for instance. If you buy, a brand new car and it's just completely perfect, you don't really bond with that car or person based on its perfection. You bond with it sort of in mutual recognition of humanity, and by that I mean mistakes and imperfections.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can love something that's perfect. So I think God is presented as something that is perfect, but on the other hand, really he demonstrates these human-like emotions and stuff largely in part for us to
relate to
relationship.
Yeah. It does seem like... What's that?
I really do think the fact that Enoch fathered Methuselah and then fathered other sons and daughters, I think that fact was put in there for a reason. I think that event was chronicled for a reason. And I know that event was incredibly life-changingly significant in my life.
Well, I agree. I was just saying that it is interesting that, he was different, for sure, because...
And I'm suggesting that's the reason he was different.
Yeah.
Is because of the kind of love, the amount of love that he felt and experienced in his life versus his contemporaries.
Yeah.
And that made him able to relate to God in a completely different manner.
Right. I was just saying that not everybody who has a kid has that response, so that's...
I agree
yeah,
with that.
unfortunately.
completely true. You're completely right.
Yeah. So I kind of lost where we were going with this. I mean, I know we were going somewhere with it. So, I guess that is kind of the thing with the story is it does seem like Enoch pleased God in some way, and that probably has to do with his desire to, not that he was a perfect person, or anything like that, but like with Abraham, we know Abraham's faith, Abraham's faith, and then Moses, these individuals, it's not that they were without sin, they...
Look at Abraham. Look at the uniqueness of Abraham's love.
Yeah.
Abraham loved Isaac. And if Abraham could have killed himself, he would have done that.
Yeah.
But he was willing to sacrifice his only son because he believed God would take care of it all.
Yeah. True. So, and this might be because this can easily segue into talking about Noah, because the story of Enoch ties right in with the story of Noah. It's kind of Enoch is kind of a prequel, I guess, like the era of Enoch is kind of a prequel to the era of Noah, what happened. That's not the best way to say it, but Noah is mentioned in the book of Enoch, and so we might end up kind of doing a little bit of a part 2 to this, because we'll be talking about Noah a little bit next week, so it'll kind of be next week will kind of be a bit of a hybrid. Again, that's just more for time, and that there's kind of more to mention here, but we don't really have the time to necessarily go into it this evening. But I did want to kind of ask the question as to, so far what we see, what is there to gain from this story that we're given, even if we're just looking at what we see in Genesis, but even more so if we look at the book of Enoch and all the information there. But I see that, God does take notice of individuals, and, God is willing to meet us, and this kind of gets to the whole topic of our series. God is meeting us where we are. This, of course, Jesus is the best example of that, but we see even in the Old Testament, God is willing to have a relationship with these individuals and relate to them in a way that is relatable to them. If that makes it's a little if that makes sense. But and also another thing is that we're here for a purpose, and we can accept or reject what that purpose is, but God, as we see with Enoch, God took Enoch, and we see in the book of Enoch that he took him, and also that there was a purpose behind that, but also, we are here for a purpose as well. We're left here for a purpose for a certain time. When that time is up, there's also a purpose to that too. So I also see that in this story, because, to everyone around, it seemed like Enoch just kind of disappeared, but they didn't necessarily know all the other things that were going on, and he's noted what makes him noteworthy in Genesis is that only 2 people in the Old Testament were taken up to be with God before they physically died. That was Enoch and I believe Elijah, right? Elijah, yeah. And the Elijah story does kind of seem like, God abducted him, basically. He was there, and then a chariot came down out of the sky, and then he was,
and
taken
upon
off.
his laser beam did he rise.
Well, I think it said a fiery chariot, right? So,
Yes.
so anyway, so those some things to think about, and we'll come back to this a little bit next week. I know I always say that, but I don't always say that, but we will. Maybe we can brush up on the Book of Enoch a little bit this week too. So, you have hands. You have something. Oh, you were holding up the time. Well, we will go.
It cuts off my hands. I
don't know. Interesting. Well, we'll continue next week, and we'll have some prayer time here. We got about 5 minutes left? 6 minutes? 7 minutes?
6
minutes.
7.
Okay, so join us next week. Enoch Part 2, going into the story of Noah and how God relates to Noah. And I think Noah will probably be a multiple one as well, because we have the before and after the flood, and during the flood too. But so anyway, that concludes this week's discussion.